Okay, so in the last video, we talked about fiscal policy, what it is. We took a look at its definition. We saw some examples from US and Bangladesh. So now let's talk about different types of fiscal policy. Now, effectively, there are two types of fiscal policy. One is an expansionary fiscal policy, and the other is contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is when the government lowers taxation and increases spending, government spending. This is also known as a fiscal stimulus. And contractionary fiscal policy is known as the scenarios where the government is increasing taxation and lowering their expenditure. Government. Both of this doesn't happen. If either happens, it's fine. So if the government only reduces tax and does nothing to its government to their expenditure, it's still an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, expansionary fiscal policy are of two types. Okay, so let's bring this down here. There are two types of expansionary fiscal policy. They are called, one is called an automatic fiscal stimulus, and the other one is called discretionary fiscal stimulus. Okay, so what are they? Now, automatic fiscal stimulus are cases that are automatically activated. So, for example, during the 2008, 9, 10 period, when there was a global recession going on and a lot of people were losing their jobs, what it did was automatically, as people were losing their jobs, they were qualifying for, let's say, unemployment benefits. So the government didn't have to do anything. Just because of the way the economy was performing, automatically government expenditure was going up because there is a policy in place that if you have been unemployed for so and so many days and so on, you qualify for unemployment benefits or a lot of other benefits as well. So this was automatic depending on the performance of the economy. A discretionary fiscal stimulus takes place when the government actually makes a plan that given the way the economy is going right now, we have to change the rate of tax, go up or down. We have to spend more or spend less. These are planned objectives of the government. So we are going to ignore automatic fiscal stimulus for the time being because it's not interesting. It's an automatic facility that's built into the system. If X happens, Y will happen. So we won't concern ourselves with that for too long. Let's focus on discretionary fiscal policy. It's when the government is actually sitting down and deciding that we need to change some things. So let me just draw a diagram first. I think that will be a bit more instructive. So suppose we have real GDP here, and we have price level here. So we have the aggregate demand curve. We have a short-run aggregate supply, and we also have a long-run aggregate supply. Right? You've all seen this diagram before if you've done the ASAT chapter. And so suppose this is the equilibrium in the economy right now. So this is how much GDP is, and this is what the price level is. I mean, if we were to give values to this, I'll just stick to the book. In the book, this is 1500, and this is how much? 110. Okay, now of course this shows us that the economy is not operating at its full capacity. At the full capacity, the economy can be producing 1600, but the economy is operating beneath that. So the government notices this. They see, of course, that this is not an ideal situation to be in. We have to do something to change this. Notice, let's go back to the definition once again. So what fiscal policy is that the government using its budget to achieve macroeconomic objectives. Simple enough. Okay, so what's happened here? The macroeconomic objective that the government want is that they want to increase output. They want to increase GDP, real GDP, so that we can go from 1500 to 1600. That's the objective. And if the government wants to achieve this objective via fiscal policy, what that means is that they will either have to change the rate of tax or they will have to change their spending. So let's write down the equation for aggregate demand first. AD, if you remember, is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net export. Now suppose what the government decide is that to increase our output, they're going to increase G. That's the fiscal policy that the government is going for, increasing their expenditure. Now let's take a look at the AD equation. If G is increasing, aggregate demand will increase, right? So let's draw that in the diagram and see what happens. Let's call this AD1, let's call this AD2. So you see, by increasing G, what the government has done is that they have increased AD in the economy. And so we arrive at this point where the output is higher than it was. Now this is a good thing. The fiscal policy has worked. Government wanted to increase output, it has gone up. But we also have to take a look at two things, okay? If G is going up, what will its effect be on C and on I? If G is going up, how will government just randomly increase G? Suppose they are undertaking more infrastructure projects. So suppose the government has started to build a highway. And by building this highway, what the government is doing is that they're creating employment opportunities. More people are finding jobs. So G has gone up, but because of the nature of this G, which is stimulating the economy, remember this is called a fiscal stimulus. They're stimulating the economy, they're creating more opportunities within the economy. Consumption is going to go up as well, because as G is creating more jobs, people have more money at hand. They want to consume more. So C is going up as well. However, another thing is going to happen as well. Now, to increase G, to increase government expenditure, let's go back to what we saw in the previous video. And let's take a look at this. Okay. Receipt minus outlay is the budget balance. So let's bring that down here. So we know that receipts minus outlays gives us the budget balance. Now, what we've also seen is that in most cases, the government operates on debt. Outlays are higher than receipts. On top of that, if the government wants to increase their expenditure even more, how will they do it? They must take loans. They have to take more loans. They were already taking loans. Now they're going to be taking even more loans. So from here, what we know is that government debt is going to go up. Now think of the loanable funds market. Let me just draw it actually. So here we have demand for loanable funds, we have supply for loanable funds, and we have an equilibrium, and this is the interest rate in the economy. Now, if the government wants more debts, that means that demand for loanable funds is going up in the economy. When this happens, interest rate is also going up. If interest rate is going up, what's going to happen to investment in the economy? Investment is going to fall. So when the government increases their expenditure, it increases consumption, we know that, but it also decreases, it may decrease investment. As a result, we get the first move from 81 to 82. This is the rise simply because government expenditure has gone up. But in the next stage, we may have AD may increase even more. This is if the change in consumption is higher than the change in investment, or let me use another color of ink. Let's use purple. AD may also fall. It's going down. This will happen when change in consumption is less than change in investment. Okay, I mean, I know the diagram looks very complicating and it might be confusing some of you. So let me just simplify it here. Okay, so what the government has noticed is that the economy is operating below potential GDP. You all know what potential GDP is from previous chapters. As a result, what the government has decided to do is to undertake expansionary fiscal policy to increase GDP. Expansionary fiscal policy means the government is either going to increase their expenditure or they're going to lower tax. In this particular example, government has decided to increase their expenditure. Okay. What we know is that aggregate demand equation is C plus I plus J plus NX. Okay, that's not right. Plus G. Okay. Now, when the government increases G, aggregate demand increases. When aggregate demand increases, we know a very simple diagram. We have AD here, we have AS here. When aggregate demand increases, what we know is that output has increased. This is good. The first step is good. The problem is we also know that if G increase, that is going to increase consumption. But if G increase, that is also going to reduce investment in the economy. Two things are going to be happening, and this is going to cause AD to increase. This is going to cause AD to fall. You see, so these two forces are pulling the AD curve in different directions. This wants to move it further right. This wants to move it to the left. And at the end of the day, what matters is which of this effect is larger. If the change in consumption, let me use another color of ink. If the change in consumption is larger than change in investment, then AD will move further right. But if the change in investment is larger than the change in consumption, AD will move a little bit back towards the left. And these are complicating analysis, and the government spent many hours using their smartest people to figure out exactly what the effect will be. We are not going to go into that much details in this course. The underlying idea that you guys should take away is that expansionary policy means that the government will increase its expenditure or reduce taxation, or the government may also decide to undertake a contractionary fiscal policy, in which case they will increase taxation or reduce government spending. I have given you guys one example here, is that when the government will want to increase their expenditure. I'm going to leave the rest as practice for you guys. So try to figure out what happens when the government reduces taxation. Try to figure out what happens, under what scenarios the government might want to implement contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, there are some examples given in the book. You can, of course, go through that. But effectively, if you understand this one example, the rest becomes very simple. So you can figure it out on your own. And so I think that's it. That's all we're going to do from fiscal policy. So if I were to sum up what we have done so far in fiscal policy, we have seen the definition, which tells us that fiscal policy is the way in which the government manipulates its budget, its receipts and outlays to achieve certain economic objectives. We've looked into what government's receipts are. They're mostly taxation. We've looked into what government's outlays are. We've seen examples from both Bangladesh and the US, which shows us that the government in most cases tends to operate on a deficit, which means government's deficit is constantly increasing in most cases. Then we've talked about the two types of fiscal policy. One is where the government tries to reduce tax or increase their expenditure. So what happens under expansionary fiscal policy is that budget deficit increases. Government already has a deficit, and when they undertake expansionary fiscal policy, the deficit increases. And the opposite happens for contractionary fiscal policy. When you're increasing tax or reducing government expenditure, is that budget deficit decreases. After that, we took a look at this one example where the economy was operating beneath potential GDP, which may be called inflationary gap. You've all learned this in the ASAD chapter. And so what the government wanted to do was go from low GDP to high GDP. And to achieve that, in this example, what the government decided to do was increase their expenditure. And we saw that things aren't as simple as they may initially appear. There are complications in it. Increasing GDP increases AD, but exactly by how much we can't say for certainty. without doing a bit more analysis, which is taking a look at the change in consumption and the change in investment. And that's it for fiscal policy. In the next video, I will be talking about monetary policy.